Our scripture reading for this morning comes from Luke, chapter 23, verses 33 through 43. Hear the word of the Lord. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by, watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is the word of the Lord.
So in the story that we just heard read this morning, there are three very important groups of people. There are the rulers and the soldiers, the people who are standing by and mocking Jesus, and then there's this third group, the criminals who are being crucified with Jesus. And each group of people has a totally different response to the hopeless situation that's right before their eyes. Because we can all agree that that's what this is, can't we? A hopeless situation. Jesus is hanging on a cross, being executed as a Roman prisoner, and there's no resurrection, at least not yet. And the people in this story don't know that there's going to be a resurrection. They don't have the rest of the gospel books to read. They don't have the benefit of knowing how the story will end like we do. For all they know, death is the end of the story, which makes sense because death usually is the end of most stories. No one at the scene of the crucifixion has ever seen anyone rise from the dead, but they have seen a lot of people die and stay dead. Well, I mean, why would this time be any different? This man, Jesus, is hanging on the cross, and he is going to die, and that will be the end of it. This crucifixion is different, though. This man, Jesus, has claimed to be the Messiah, the King of the Jews, the Son of God. He says he's the Messiah that they've all been waiting for, who's going to bring about this new kingdom. And he's done miraculous things. He's healed people with leprosy. He's driven out demons. He's fed thousands of people with food that was only enough for a few. He's healed those with chronic, lifelong illnesses. He's baptized many. He's given sight to people who are blind, and he's even raised some from the dead. Time and time again, Jesus has instilled a new hope into people. And yet, here Jesus is in our story today, hanging on a cross. It doesn't make sense. If he has all of this power, why isn't he using it? The Messiah that we've all been waiting for can't suffer and die like this. It doesn't feel right. It's not fair. It's not what we've expected, and we don't understand how all of this suffering fits in with a Messiah who's supposed to bring hope. The soldiers, the crowds, and the two criminals that are hanging on the crosses may all be thinking the same thing. What hope? What power and what salvation? There are none of these things here. And while Jesus' situation seems especially hopeless and senseless, he's not alone in being caught in situations like this. Sometimes we are faced with situations that seem utterly hopeless, entirely dark, and threaten to swallow us up in their abyss. We may not be watching someone die on a cross, but we have all had times when we look at what's happening in our lives and we think, there is no hope. Where is God? Can God still save? Maybe for you, the situation is a marriage that, though once life-giving, has recently crumbled. Maybe your situation is that you've lost a job and you have no idea how you're going to make ends meet for your family. Or your mother or father has recently passed away and you just don't know how to navigate life without their constant presence. Or maybe you've just moved to a new place and the transition has been harder than you thought, and you're wondering if you can adjust to these unfamiliar things. A few years ago, when I was beginning my first year of seminary, I had one of these hopeless, dark times. I had just moved to New Jersey from the Midwest, and it was a bit of a culture shock for me. I had left my main support system behind in Illinois, and I was floundering without them. I was also experiencing an extreme time of depression. But at first, in September, I had hoped that this time of transition and depression would not last forever. I had hope that this was only for a time and that God was still present in that time. But then, before long, September turned into October, and October into November, and then November into December. And before long, I was questioning, like the people in our story this morning may have been, where is God? Can God still save? Like those at the crucifixion who may have been wondering, is Jesus who he says he is? Is there any hope left? I was wondering those very same things. And in our story this morning, people respond to this seemingly hopeless situation in very different ways. The first group, the soldiers and the rulers, they respond by mocking Jesus, taunting him, ridiculing him. Twice they tell him, save yourself. If you're so great, if you are who you say you are, if you really did heal all those people and turn water into wine and raise people from the dead, then save yourself. And if you don't save yourself or somehow change the situation of intense suffering, then maybe you aren't who you say you are. The soldiers and rulers are calling attention to the fact that Jesus is doing nothing. Is Jesus really able to save at all? Where is the hope in this suffering? While the soldiers and the rulers respond by publicly mocking Jesus, the second group of people in this story, the crowds who have gathered, just stand and watch. That's all Luke tells us about this group. In verse 35, we read, "The people stood watching." That's it. They are silent onlookers rather than active participants in our story. Now, they aren't taking part in mocking Jesus, but they aren't standing up and confessing or defending Jesus either. According to Luke, no one has stood up and said, "Stop. I know who this man is. I've seen the miracles he's done, and I still believe that salvation is real." Maybe they too are overwhelmed by their circumstances. overwhelmed by their sadness that things are ending this way, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of it all. Maybe some in the crowds were actually there when Jesus did some of these miracles. Maybe they've seen these things with their own eyes. But how are they supposed to believe and hold on to what they know is true when all they see is suffering? But then there's this other group of people in the story today that we haven't really talked about yet. And that's the two criminals who are hanging on the crosses on other sides of Jesus. And unlike the soldiers and the watching crowds, the two criminals may not actually know who Jesus is. It's very possible that they were in jail for a good part of Jesus' ministry. So they may not know very much about him. The first criminal that Luke mentions joins the soldiers in mocking Jesus. And for a third time in our story, we hear someone say, "Save yourself." And us, this man adds. So this criminal not only wants Jesus' power so that Jesus can save himself, but he also wants Jesus to save himself. Save us from our own suffering, he cries out. But the second criminal in this story, his response is different, and it's something that we should pay attention to. First, he acknowledges that Jesus is innocent. Somehow, he knows that Jesus has done nothing wrong. And then he says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." What an interesting response. First, it's interesting because the criminal addresses Jesus by using exactly that name, Jesus. In Luke's gospel, other than his closest disciples, only people who were possessed by demons or asking for healing ever called him by his name, Jesus. But the criminal calls him Jesus, which is a name that means the Lord saves. By simply using Jesus' name, this man is making a statement. Jesus, I believe that the Lord saves. Even in this moment when everything seems hopeless and all I see is suffering, the Lord still saves. And all of this leads us to the question, how did he know? How did he know who Jesus was when everything about the situation pointed to something else? Jesus claims to have the power to save, but yet he's still hanging on a cross, dying, and yet this criminal knew Jesus still has the power to save. How was he able to believe in a salvation at the exact moment when no one was being saved? I'd like to suggest that the criminal was able to recognize salvation and hope, because sometimes it's in those desperate situations when salvation becomes the most real to us. It's in those moments when a marriage is crumbling, or we lose a job and we can't make payments, or one of our loved ones dies and we have to navigate the world differently now, or we're feeling lost and alone in a new place. It's in those moments when our worlds are crumbling that salvation and hope are also the most real. During that December of my first year of seminary, my depression had worsened so that I couldn't really function anymore. Things had not gotten better, and the remaining shreds of hope that I once had disappeared. One night, when I didn't really know what else to do, I called a suicide hotline, and I talked with a worker there about what was going on. I don't really even remember what we talked about anymore. But I do know that the moment that I reached for that phone and dialed that number and reached out was the exact same moment that I was affirming that salvation is real, that there is hope, and that despite what I was experiencing and all evidence to the contrary, hope is alive because Jesus does save. Somehow, in the depths of our suffering, there can still be hope. This is what the criminal recognized. And when he reaches out and says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom," Jesus responds with this: "Today, I tell you, you will be with me in paradise." The word today in Greek does mean today, but it also means this very day, and sometimes it means what has happened today. It's also been translated as meaning last night. So there's a sense to this word, a sense that means what's actually happening right now and what has happened before. It's not a future-looking word. It's a very in-this-moment word. It's the moment when God's salvation fractures time, which is what happened in this story. Patrick Wilson, a theologian and a writer, he writes this: "The criminal asks to be remembered right when we find not the slightest shred of evidence that such a kingdom exists, ever has existed, or ever will exist. But the criminal asks anyway. Somehow he has found a way to recognize salvation that intrudes into the absolutely hopeless moment where no one is being saved from suffering and death, which is also exactly the moment when salvation breaks through." End quote. Jesus responds to this man by saying, "Today, right now, you are with me in paradise." And I wonder if he's saying, today, right now, salvation is breaking through into this hopeless moment. Jesus, as he did with the criminal in this story, sees our todays. He sees those situations that we are in that seem hopeless and dark, our relationships that are falling apart, our bills that we can't pay, our loved ones who have recently died. Whatever our today situation is, Jesus knows that suffering. And yet, he still responds with, "Today, I will be with you in paradise." So may we, brothers and sisters, develop eyes to see God's salvation fracturing time in precisely those moments when no one is being saved. May we, like the criminal in this story, be able to look at situations where God's kingdom seems absent and at that same moment see salvation. May we have hope in those hopeless moments because we know that it is precisely in our hopeless todays that salvation breaks through. Amen.